America was built on the power of protest. On moments when our voices launched movements, but none more pivotal than this.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
On this day, 58 years ago, my father, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., challenged America to live up to its promise for all of us, to recognize that every voice deserves to be heard.
But now, some are trying to silence us.
So it's time to get louder.
Without voting rights for all, there is democracy for none.
That's why today we have to march.
Raise our voices.
Pick up the phone
to cause a little good trouble.
And make this country live up to its promise for all Americans.
So rise up, America.
Rise up.
Your voice is your power.
The time to use it is now.
Hello, Alabama. Hello, America. Thank you to everyone who is here with us in this full capacity online room today. And thank you to everyone who is watching us online. I'm Hanu Karlapalam, and I have the honor of being the organizer of this rally. But this rally is not happening not because of me. This event is made possible by March On for Voting Rights team, People for Democracy, which is a group of pro-democracy organizations in Alabama, to conduct the march, our speakers and panelists, and more importantly, our technology partner, ViewMix Inc., who are providing this online platform called Video Cafe. I personally would like to thank my good friend, my undergrad engineering classmate, founder and CEO of ViewMix and Video Cafe, Govind Kichpat, and his colleague Steve, and numerous technical staff behind the scenes. Govind is actually watching, and he's monitoring from the control room in San Jose, California. We like to thank all of them. We are live streaming this online Video Cafe room to our YouTube channel of People for Democracy and Facebook. Finally, we got through that live streaming, so now it is working. So sometimes, we have a little bit of technical issues, so let us not panic. Everything is going to be all right. If there are any issues, if anyone is unable to get through, please wait, and ultimately you'll be able to get through this into the room. Please share and use the hashtag Voting Rights March. Also, please text pledge to 89799. Text pledge to 89799, or go to votingrightspledge.org. We have an excellent lineup of speakers and panelists, and some great videos in between. We just saw one from Dr. King's family. Get inspired. And here is a brief overview of what is coming up. We will have 4 speakers. First, followed immediately with a panel discussion. Then we will have 4 more speakers, followed immediately with another panel discussion. And we will try it. If some of the speakers and panelists are unable to get into this room, we will figure out, maybe I will put them on the phone, and I will keep this speakerphone in front of this so that at least you can hear their voice. Attendees in this room can participate in the Q&A by raising your virtual hand. You can actually see it on the right side of your screen. Just hover. Just hover your mouse on the screen, and you'll figure out. So please stick around until the end of the program. It's going to be really good. I can promise you that. America needs your attention and your time today. So please stick around. At this time, let us observe a moment of silence for the US service members, US civilians, and Afghanistan civilians who were killed in the terrorist attack in Kabul. Thank you. Since January of this year, 48 states have introduced 389 bills that amount to outright voter suppression, and many have already become law. Racist, anti-democratic, with a small d, voter suppression laws amount to rigging the game. But in America, elections are not a game, and lives depend on the outcomes. Marching is a form of nonviolent protest, and protest is a form of democratic expression older than America itself. We march to shine the light of the truth on what is happening in state legislatures, ensure that Americans understand what's at stake, and give people a mechanism to demand action on the most urgent issue of our generation. Now please give a big round of applause to yourself, to you, for taking time on this Saturday afternoon. Here in Alabama, it's already afternoon. Thank you. And the speakers and panelists. So let's get started. Democracy is always under attack. People whose agenda cannot flourish when all people have an equal say, there is intimidation, misinformation, and disruption to undermine the democratic process and suppress the political will of their opponents. How can we counteract such groups? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Senior Supervising Attorney of Southern Poverty Law Center, Karen Short.
Thank you, Hanu. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Hanu said, my name is Karen Short. I'm a voting rights attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Our headquarters is in Montgomery, and we have offices in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, and Washington, D.C. I work in the Voting Rights Practice Group at the SPLC, and I personally focus on protecting and defending the right to vote in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Alabama holds a special place in my heart, though, because I called Alabama home for 6 years. The state of Alabama and the long fight for equal voting rights are intertwined. Throughout its history, Alabama lawmakers have created and enforced numerous obstacles to registering to vote, remaining an active voter, casting a ballot, and having that ballot counted. These obstacles disproportionately target and impact Alabama's Black residents and have been the subject of some of the most consequential voting rights cases of the past century, including Gomillion versus Lightfoot, Reynolds versus Sims, City of Mobile versus Bolden, and of course Shelby County versus Holder. Tireless advocates have fought and bled in Alabama in the struggle for voting rights and civil rights. Here, Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks galvanized the Montgomery bus boycott. Here in his home state, Representative John Lewis was brutally attacked by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on Bloody Sunday, alongside Black Alabamians like Amelia Boynton and their allies. Their efforts and sacrifices pushed Congress to pass the most effective civil rights legislation ever implemented, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to ensure ongoing federal oversight for states like Alabama that had long disregarded the Constitution's command that every citizen have an equal say at the ballot box. The VRA has been a powerful tool to challenge Alabama's racially discriminatory voter suppression measures. While Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was in effect, the Department of Justice stopped more than 100 discriminatory voting changes from being implemented. In 2013, however, Shelby County, Alabama prevailed in its effort to weaken the VRA when the U.S. Supreme Court suspended the coverage formula in Section 4 that determined which states and localities had to first obtain federal approval under Section 5's crucial pre-clearance provisions before implementing any voting changes. The state wasted no time clamping down on voting rights. Within 24 hours of the Shelby County decision, the state implemented a restrictive photo ID law, and over the following months systematically closed dozens of photo ID issuing offices in primarily Black communities, making it more difficult for Black voters to obtain the IDs they needed to vote under the new law. Today, the state routinely closes polling places in Black communities and purges eligible voters from the rolls, refuses to expand voting opportunities such as early and no excuse absentee voting, and denies the right to vote to thousands of people with felony convictions through its overly burdensome and restrictive felony disenfranchisement law. Along with several state partners, the SPLC recently submitted a report into the congressional record documenting the state's extensive current record of racial discrimination in voting. In the report, which I will drop into the chat, we include dozens of stories from Alabama voters. These voters explain what barriers to the ballot have been for them recently. For example, Doris, a voter in Mobile County, has seen her designated polling location move 3 times since 2008, each time farther and farther away from her home. She used to be able to walk to vote, but she had to drive several miles to her new polling location for the 2020 election. With so many Mobile County voters headed to a reduced number of polling locations, Doris had experienced long lines and has had difficulty finding parking. When Doris and her brother arrived at their polling place to vote in the 2020 election, they had to park on the sidewalk and then walk a long distance to their polling place, a particularly difficult challenge for her brother who uses a cane. Doris recalls that when they arrived to vote around 7 a.m., there was already about 100 people in line to vote. State lawmakers continue to curtail access to ballot. Recent anti-voter legislation in the state banned curbside voting, a practice offered in many states to provide safe and secure access to in-person voting for voters with physical disabilities. Despite presenting no evidence that curbside voting has been used anywhere in the state, let alone evidence that curbside voting harms election security, the state now bans this safe and accessible option for voters. Notwithstanding lawmakers' relentless attempts to restrict access to the ballot box, Alabama voters continue to fight back. As documented in our report, Latasha from Jefferson County stated, quote, "For generations who had to live through the Jim Crow era before me, I needed to cast my vote. I want to be an agent of change for the future. I believe that voting gives you your voice and the ability to change laws to help generations down the line," end quote. The state's relentless commitment to finding new ways to keep Black Alabamians and other historically disenfranchised voters from making their voices heard underscores the urgent need for Congress to take decisive action. Voting should be a simple, accessible process for everyone. But in Alabama, it is hard to vote, especially if you are a voter of color. Through H.R. 4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which recently passed the U.S. House of Representatives, Congress has the opportunity and the obligation to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act. Signing H.R. 4 into law would push this country toward finally realizing the as yet unfulfilled promise of the 15th Amendment, that no state will deny or abridge the right to vote based on race. Thank you so much for allowing the SPLC to be part of this space, and I look forward to discussing this critical issue with you all today.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to the Southern Poverty Law Center for participating. Our next speaker is having some technical difficulty, so please bear with her and with us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put her on my speakerphone, and hopefully everyone can listen to her. So we are sorry for that technical difficulty. So let me go ahead and introduce her. We are a government of laws, said John Adams, not of men. But laws do not create themselves. What have we done? What are we doing? And what can we as citizens continue to do to ensure that our laws preserve our constitutional democracy and that they are effectively, fairly enforced? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, of Alabama, Jaton Bosby.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Hanu, for allowing me to come and speak today on such a powerful and impactful day as we celebrate essentially not just today with the March for Voting Rights, but also it is the anniversary of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, and I think that is especially poignant as we come and gather here today virtually and our colleagues in person across this country. When we talk about voting rights, and I bring you greetings from Montgomery, Alabama, which is the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement, we cannot discuss the power of people and voting as it relates to our collective action. This story particularly begins in Marion, Alabama, with the murder, the state-sanctioned murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, where you had folks gather and essentially attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery to ensure their voices were heard. While they were beaten back on those days in March of 1965, they gathered again to march that 54-mile trek from Selma to Montgomery to ensure their voices were heard and to ensure that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. Now, 56 years later, we are still continuing this fight. We understand that there is the duality of voting rights in the state of Alabama, not only the 1965 VRA that was passed, but when we think about the stripping of voting rights that happened in 2013 in Shelby v. Holder. And we are seeing that also as the federal courts also pulled back Section 2 of that same act. Now, as we are forced to combat state legislatures, particularly in Alabama, that are limiting curbside voting, that are limiting the very systems and organizing tactics that really helped build political power and extend voting rights that this country has seen, particularly in the South and in the state of Alabama. Those are the challenges that we foresee. We are excited about the advancement of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The truth of the matter is we are still fighting. And that impactful work is not done without the organizers and the gap fillers in this state. And so many of them are joining us not only virtually, but also on this call. So I leave with you today really the charge to continue this work, because it's not done individually, but it is done collectively. And I'm excited about the work that we will continue to do to extend voting rights, to ensure we are doing the work to build fair and transparent maps as we go through this redistricting process, and to learn together, because although we are seeing this collective power building, we are also seeing the regression of that. But that has not deterred us, and it will not deter us as we continue progressing and advancing together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jaton, and thank you to your Thank you, Jaton, again. That was so nice of you. And thank you to ACLU of Alabama for participating. So we'll probably do the same thing with the panel too, panel discussion. Thank you again. Not all voters are under attack. Some politicians are targeting people of color, immigrants, and poor people to suppress their vote. What are representatives of those people doing to protect their right to suppress? And how can we as citizens help? Please welcome a veteran and the president of the Alabama State Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, Bernard Similton.
Thank you, Hanu, and thanks to all the other speakers and panel members for taking time out of your busy Saturday schedule to participate in this virtual march. And also for all those who are marching in Washington, D.C. on the sweltering heat of an August summer, we salute you, and we are just standing with you virtually as if we were there. Hanu, I want to thank you for putting this virtual march together here in Alabama, because without you, we would not have had this, and all those who were supporting behind the scenes and everything. We thank you. I come today to reflect and to give some direction on what we need to do as people of color to ensure that our voting rights are protected. And as most of you know, the march in 1963 was about jobs and freedom. It was about economic equality. It was about voting rights, and it was about civil rights. And today, 58 years later, we are still marching for those basic rights for people of color. And some of you are probably saying, well, you know, we've elected our first African-American president in 2008 and re-elected him again in 2012. And we have people of color serving in all kinds of leadership positions in the government at the highest level, as well as serving in corporate on all levels of leadership. And we saw in 2020, we elected our first female and person of color vice president. And you're probably saying America is in a post-racial era. But that is the farthest things from the truth. And in 2021, people of color are still struggling. And I emphasize struggling for equality, and especially when it comes to voting rights. And there are those out there that are saying people of color have equal rights to vote. And that is true. We do have the right, equal right to vote. But the problem comes is, do we have the equal access to the ballot? And that's where the difference come in, because we do not have equal access to the ballot. Today, we see that people of color are ability to have unfettered access to the ballot box is challenged in areas of voting. I believe there are those who spend many hours at night studying voting patterns of people of color and developing legislation that will limit or inhibit the ability of particular race to vote. And for instance, we saw record voting turnout in 2020 election, with more states allowing people to vote by mail in record numbers due to the pandemic. And this told us one thing, that if you make the ballot access, equal access, or easy access, then people will vote. It's when you establish these roadblocks in the name of preventing people from cheating that people will be deterred and inhibited from voting. It is more important today than ever to push back on voter suppression laws that we see in Georgia and across this country, such as allowing people to stand in voting lines for hours to not receive food from others. Also, voter suppression is making people stand in lines for hours to vote, which means they will either have to take off from work or try to vote after work. And this disproportionately affect people of color. We need to establish more voting places in large cities so that people will not have to stand in long lines, no more than 30 minutes, an hour at the most, to cast their vote. And if you remember, in 2020 election, there were places like Philadelphia where people were having parties. The DJ were playing some nice sounds to try and reduce the stress of people standing in long lines, and it gave them the confidence to, you're on the right track. Just stay in there, hang in there. You're going to get your chance to vote. We should not have to do that in America. With the technology we have, we should not have to stand in long lines in order to cast your vote. But immediately after the election, what happened? More voter suppression all across the country. In Alabama, the legislature has already passed a law that banned curbside voting, even though we never voted by curbside in Alabama. However, curbside voting would be beneficial to those who are physically challenged to get out of their vehicles, to walk to the polling places to vote. And just imagine if a person who is physically challenged have to stand in line 4 or 5 hours to cast their vote. I'd like to share with you how the Brennan Center has characterized suppressive voting laws in Alabama. They say between January the 1st and July the 14th, 2021, at least 18 states have enacted 30 laws that will restrict access to the ballot. 18 states and 30 laws. These laws make mail voting and early voting more difficult, impose harsher voter ID requirements, and make faulty voter purges more likely. And we've seen that here in the state of Alabama. Also, more than 400 bills with provisions that restrict voting access were introduced in 49 states in 2021 legislative sessions. And can you imagine what is coming in 2022? So as we face more voter suppression laws across the country, people of color must band together to register more people to vote, educate more voters, and then began to bring more voters to the polls on election day. We must agree to vote for those who will represent our interests. These efforts will not be easy and will not occur overnight. We must work with our millennial age group to educate them in their own language and in their own ways of the importance of engaging in the political process to include voting. Because our millennial voters, they think different, they react different. And the old tactics of, well, my grandfather voted, my grandfather had to pay poll taxes. Yes, those are true statements. But we got to find a way to reach our millennials. voters to make sure that they are able to carry this legacy on. We must find federal courts that are willing to strike down these voter suppressive laws and then flood those courts with lawsuits to demand equal access to the poll. Finally, we must band together to demand that the Senate pass the recently House passed John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Advancement Act. And we must also fight for the passage of For the People Act. These are critical pieces of legislation that will contribute to a fair and equitable election for all. These pieces of critical legislation will ensure that our next generation will have access, and I emphasize the word access, to the ballot. So my challenge today is for the people of color to band together with those white Americans who believe in a free and fair election, to join together, to fight together, to march together, to go to jail together, to demand equal access to the vote. The question today is, will we join together, or will we let the suppressors continue to divide us? Thank you very much. Look forward to any questions you have later on. I think it's back to you, Hanu.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you to the Alabama State Conference of the NAACP for participating. Our next speaker had some internet issues, and he's back.
He's back.
Yes, so let me go ahead and introduce him. The labor movement epitomizes the democratic ideal that people acting together under rules fairly adopted and applied can achieve their common goals. Labor is sorely affected when democracy wanes. How will organized labor help to protect voting rights and a liberal democracy? How can we help? Please welcome a labor activist and a co-host of a local radio show, The Labor Report, Adam Keller.
Hello. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. My name is Adam Keller, and I'm an activist and organizer here in North Alabama. I'm a former high school history teacher and recently spent several years working as a labor organizer and representative of public education employees here in Huntsville. A variety of elected leadership roles within the National Education Association as well as the National Staff Organization. And as Hanu mentioned, I'm currently a co-host of the Valley Labor Report, which is, as far as we know, the only weekly union talk radio show in the state. And I've been involved in a variety of justice-centered causes and organizations. I recognize a lot of familiar faces here today. And I am a proud union member with the Industrial Workers of And I really appreciate the invite and for including the labor movement perspective on this very important conversation. Attacks on voting rights are attacks on the working class. We know that the various tactics that y'all have already discussed, from expansive voter ID laws to the effects of mass incarceration, these all disproportionately affect working people. And in the United States of America, the working class is disproportionately people of color. So these issues are absolutely intertwined. I think it's fitting, since we are doing this today on August 28th, that bring up a little bit of historical context, because the labor movement has always been critical to winning and defending our right to vote. Today is the anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. And we should remember not just the powerful words and efforts of Dr. King, but also the role that labor unions and labor leaders like A. Philip Randolph and Walter Reuther of the UAW, the role they played in pulling off that massive action. The last thing that Dr. King did was to travel to Memphis, Tennessee. And he was there to support striking sanitation workers. Martin Luther King Jr. understood, as all of us here today understand, that your rights as a worker are intimately tied to your rights as a citizen. We also should remember that labor played a massive role in securing women's suffrage. And it was the labor organizing efforts in the aftermath of the tragic 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that really helped make some of the final pushes needed to secure the 19th Amendment. Over the past 5 decades, we've seen some really disturbing trends. We've seen a massive decline in union membership, and unsurprisingly, we've seen a massive growth in wealth and income inequality. As union membership has declined, wages have remained stagnant. And as wages have remained stagnant and our union membership declined and wealth inequality has skyrocketed, the role in which big money plays in our elections has also skyrocketed. That is a area where labor unions really have a unique situation to beat it back, because unions have a relationship with their members. Unions are uniquely positioned to mobilize these members to the polls. And unions have access to resources. And resources is where we are completely outnumbered and outgunned. We know that there are a handful of billionaires and corporations that can single-handedly sway elections. The data is very clear that more often than not, the candidate with the most money wins the election. Labor unions do have PACs. And, you know, despite sometimes the false equivalency made in the media, there is a difference between a union PAC and a corporate PAC, or, you know, dark money organization to influence elections. You know, this is an opportunity for union members to chip in a few dollars every month and to actually have some input on the endorsements and the spending made by their union to participate in elections. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, and I haven't shared this with Ken or Hanu when they invited me, but of course I was happy to help this effort and glad to see that labor was considered. But there was a little hesitation I had because, like a lot of people, especially of my generation, I've, you know, been a little disillusioned with the role in which elections can play in our society, and sometimes the difficulty in actually electoral politics. I think oftentimes the conversations around politics and justice center so much around elections and voting that we neglect the many other opportunities that we have to organize change. And we have organizations such as the ones on this call today who fight it out in the courts. We have organizations that use grassroots activism, that lobby legislators, that do research and policy. We have folks out here who are organizing tenants. They're organizing in their community at the neighborhood level. And for me, most importantly, we have to organize our workplaces. We have to organize workers shop by shop, industry by industry. When I first started getting into politics, I remember there was a saying that I ran into a lot on the more radical side of left-wing politics, which was, well, if voting changed anything, they wouldn't let us do it. And as a young radical, that kind of resonated a little bit with me. But as I look around in 2021, it's very obvious that they are trying to keep us from doing it. Clearly, there must be a reason why folks on the other side are making it harder to vote. Obviously, it's not useless, it's not irrelevant, or they wouldn't be trying to keep us from using it. So for me, I look at it in a little bit more nuanced view that voting and elections are tools in our toolbox. They're not the only tool. Maybe they're not even necessarily the right tool every time, but they're vital to defending our communities and our interest as working class people. So that's something that I think is very relevant to the labor movement today. As I mentioned, we've played a huge role over the years in securing our voting rights. We represent kind of a opportunity to push back against big money because we have some organized people and we have some of our own organized money. But the elections that we have today, because they are so dominated by big money, organizing is our only way to be able to even the odds a little bit and give us a fair chance to win. Organizing in the workplace can build a solidarity that really can bridge the divides that we have in our country. Labor organizing presents an opportunity for solidarity that can span beyond ideology and the divisions that politics and the media so often increase in our country. And the reason why these matter so much to as a worker and to all of us who are working class people in our working conditions, in our safety standards at work, and our wages. When an employee has their civil rights violated, their rights to be free from discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, they have the right to file a complaint with the EEOC. Well, that's federal government appointments. When we as workers have to pursue lost wages, we are subject to the discretion of elected. When we as educators are pushing for pay raises, it's elected school boards and elected legislators that ultimately vote on these salaries. Right now, under the Biden administration, we have seen some positive change under the National Labor Relations Board. The NLRB is who governs private industry union elections. They oversee these elections. They are supposed to regulate the behavior of both unions and companies, both during their elections as well as during the collective bargaining process. And so it's so important that those of us in labor can elect folks who make the kind of appointments we need to have a fair shot. So that when an employee is terminated in retaliation for organizing, that we have a chance to bring that worker back to work. Right now, the major legislative priority of the labor movement is the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And that would be the most significant labor law reform since President FDR. That's how long it's been since we've really had some positive traction. And that's part of the reason why it is so important that we still have the right to vote and the ability to be effective with our right to vote. Because if we were to pass the PRO Act, companies would finally face some real penalties for their illegal union busting activities. It would be more likely that we could defend workers who organize on the job, defend them from retaliation. There would be a little bit more of a level playing field so that those workers who want to organize a new union would have more of an opportunity to do so. Are why I believe the labor movement has to be in this conversation. No, it's not our only tool. It's not a replacement for organizing in our workplaces. But it's something that we have to utilize so that we have officials who will listen to labor, and who will ensure that the regulations and standards that we've secured over the past century are remaining intact. So that's why I do really appreciate that the labor movement was considered in part of this conversation. I think that it's very important that all of us in these various spaces, whether you are fighting for racial justice or economic justice, environmental justice, I think it's important that we all remain connected because all of our struggles are connected. So thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to learning more from our speakers.
Thank you, Adam, for participating. I mean, these are the faces and voices of the real faces and the real voices of Alabama. Those, audience who are joining from out of state, we really appreciate. For taking part in this session. At this time, we will have a 20-minute panel discussion. You can raise your hand to be in the queue to ask a question. Hover your mouse on the right side of your screen and click the hand symbol to be put in the queue. Please welcome the moderator for the panel discussions, Ken Hines.
Ken, just unmute.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. Thank you again for participating, to you in the audience and to the people who have already made presentations. Some of those people who made presentations are going to be participating in the panel. The panel has two purposes. The first purpose is for the panel members themselves to be able to communicate with one another how they might interact in accomplishing the goals that we have that are common goals. The second is to allow the panel and the speakers to interact with the audience to get your point of view and hear your questions. We'll start off with about 10 minutes of conversation within the panel, and then I'll switch and we'll allow participation by the audience. Let me reintroduce panel members. Tish Fox of the American Civil Liberties Union, Karen Short with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Bernard Simelton, the Alabama State Coordinator for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and Adam Keller, representing the labor movement. I'm going to start this out with a question I'll throw up. It comes from some things that Karen said during her presentation, and what I'm wondering is, it seems as if, and from several of the different presentations, I get the impression that voter suppression and other civil liberties problems have persisted in Alabama, been pervasive in Alabama, year after year after year, decade after decade. What contributes to that persistence? Why is it that we keep having to fight these same battles in these same arenas year after year? And anyone who wants to jump in first, jump in now. It's very quiet out there.
This should go.
Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Again, my name is Tish Goettel Fox. I'm the legal director here at ACLU of Alabama. I would suggest that perhaps the reason that we still see these attempts at preventing easy access to the ballot box is because in many ways those efforts appear to be successful. If you think about our last few election cycles, we keep seeing fewer and fewer people turn out for elections out of concern, one, that their votes will not be counted, or two, even if they are counted, there's going to be some inappropriate action that brings into question the validity of the election at the end of the day. What we see then is a campaign of doubt and disappointment meant to discourage people from turning out to vote, but also leading people to question whether their vote is going to actually have an impact on the outcome of the election. What we know, however, is that voting matters, especially in close elections. What we know is that fraud and other inappropriate activity is uncommon, and when it occurs, it is detected, prosecuted, and prevented from occurring again. Despite those facts of information, there is still the effort to undermine and dissuade voters from feeling as though they have an impact on the overall process. And so what we are called to do is to encourage people to fight back, not by staying at home, not by questioning the veracity of the results, but by turning out and continuing to fight as often as possible and as often as necessary. And that is what the work of the ACLU and the other organizations entails in the time between major election cycles.
Thank you.
Can I address that also?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this is Bernard Simonton for those who, I don't know if you can see my name or not, but anyway, I think the other part of that is with the increase in the minority population in the country, there's a fear that in the not too distant future, the white establishment will no longer be in power. And so our vote is our voice. And if they can silence our voices, then they can remain in power, even though we may be in large numbers. You know, if you look at South Africa with the apartheid movement, you know, where they had the black, if you will, population with just significant numbers more than the white population, but because of these repressive laws that they had, they kept those people, you know, essentially in bondage, you know, for years. And that's what, if we can take away a person's voice, if we can take away their dignity, they have nothing left. And so these repressive laws, that's what they're attempting to do, is take away our voice. But we as a voting population that concerned about equal rights for all, and the NAACP has fought for this for many years, we have to band together, we have to stick together and to overturn these repressive laws. We have to elect federal judges that we can appeal to when states like Alabama implement these repressive laws, that they will overturn those. And again, as I said earlier, on the federal level, we certainly have to pass more voter-friendly legislation that is before Congress. So I think, you know, some of those movements, we will, if we can, again, join together, if we can convince our millennial voters, and that's really where I'm concerned about those millennial voters who I don't think take the voting as seriously as, you know, people my age does. So thank you very much.
Hey,
Thank
if
you.
I could,
Yes,
Ken, can I chime in just for a second? This is Adam.
absolutely, Adam.
There were a couple of things that Tish mentioned that I just thought were really, really good, and I wanted to pull out a little bit more because I think it is important to note that it's not just about like blocking someone's access per se, though that's definitely a piece of it. Some of it really is about the discouragement of trying to get people to not even take the step of registering, trying to get people to not even take the effort to show up at the polls. And I think there's so much truth to what she said about sowing confusion, causing doubt, causing some people to wonder, okay, well, will I get in trouble if I do this the wrong way? The changing deadlines, changing polling places, all these little things that, by itself may not be huge, but once you start to add them up, it makes a real difference on the margins. And that's where these elections are won primarily. So I think that's big. And in terms of Alabama specifically, I think we can't make one of the highest incarceration rates in the country, which itself has the highest incarceration rate on planet Earth. And therefore, is a very convenient way to disenfranchise primarily working class people, primarily people of color. And, in terms of why Alabama specifically, well, because Reconstruction was never completed here, to be quite frank. And, we had a multiracial populist movement in the 1890s that was smashed by the white elites, and it resulted in the 1901 Constitution, which enshrined white supremacy and restricted voting rights. And we see every turn that you saw multiracial coalitions in this state vying for power, you saw the backlash. Both Bernard and Tish were getting at this backlash that anytime there is this perception that the wealthy, powerful white elites are going to lose some grip on power, that's when you see the increased disinformation, or that's when you see racism being really stoked as a way and by working people against each other.
Okay. Thank you, Adam. I'm going to ask one more question before we go to the audience. But I think this is an important question. So much seems to be riding on the new Voting Rights Act. And so much years ago, and I can remember very well, was active in this very well when the Voting Rights Act passed many, many decades ago. How much was riding on that Voting Rights Act? This Voting Rights Act may not pass. That Voting Rights Act has been partially overturned and vitally overturned in some ways by the courts. What happens if we have to deal with the problems we're dealing with without that kind of overreaching broad federal legislation? Can we win? It's very quiet again out there.
Yeah, I'll take that one. If I may, this is Karen again from SPLC. We, along with the tireless but certainly tired advocates and activists and voters who have been doing this work for decades and decades, will continue to do what they've been doing, and that is fighting back, continuing to push back against racial discrimination in voting. It has always been the advocates, the voters who have been pushing against voter suppression. The federal government steps in only when forced. I mean, only after Bloody Sunday was broadcast in homes across America did the federal government finally step in and pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It took way too much to get that passed. And as you said, it's taking a lot to get H.R. 4 passed. And so if it doesn't, which we hope it will, and we're doing everything in our power to make sure that it does, people will continue to fight. We have groups across the Deep South and across the country that are fighting back against these suppressive laws, that are doing everything they can, including the ACLUs, the NAACP, all of these advocacy groups that are frankly spending money and time that they should be able to spend on other things, just trying to help voters understand these complicated laws, getting to early voting, to understand absentee ballot processes that are too complicated. And that's what folks will continue to do to help overcome these hurdles that shouldn't be there in the first place. And legal advocates will continue to file lawsuits to strike down these suppressive laws like the ones that have been passed in Georgia and Florida. That's what we'll continue to do. We'll continue to fight, and we will win. We've seen this before. We'll continue to do it, but hopefully the federal government will step in as it should.
And we should remind everyone that before the Voting Rights Act was adopted, there was still fighting going on. There was still the push and the effort to secure and protect the right of access to the ballot through the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. This is not a statutory dependent right of interest. This is a core constitutional value that if we are to retain our republic, we must ensure that the voters have the right to decide who their leadership is going to be. It is no accident that the VRA seems to be at the sunset of its usefulness. However, every year, every election cycle, those in power demonstrate that they will do anything to remain in power. It is the effort and the will of people of good conscience to demand that their leadership take up their community concerns and interests. And the people of Alabama, every election cycle, come out in higher and higher numbers in support of that core principle of democracy. And so what we are calling people to do this year is to be active and involved in the process of redistricting, to be vocal and present as you ask the questions of how we determine the districts through which we select our leaders to make policy decisions for everyone. And this is not a Republican or a Democratic question. This is a will of the people versus the will of the empowered question. And while all of us may differ in our political policy preferences, we agree that we have a role.
Thank you for those answers.
Kent, I think, if you see where Georgia is versus where Georgia was, a few years ago, you would never said that Georgia is going to be, again, I'm saying blue, but, with the number of people turning out to vote. And it's through investment in the people, talking to people, encouraging them to get out and exercise your right to vote, letting them know that there may be long lines, and you got to prepare them much like they prepared the people for the bus rides through the South. You're going to get some hard laws. You're going to face some difficult legislation over here by the city, the state, not state, but the county. so you got to prepare people for what is to come. And through preparing them, you educate them what's at the end that you're voting for. I mean, what you're standing in line for. Yes, you're standing in line to cast your vote, but it's a lot more important is that big prize that we've got to keep in focus. And I think if we can educate people on that, because if we don't, and this country goes back to where we were during the 60s and 70s, and we're not too far from that. But if we go back to that, it's going to be a horrible situation for a lot of people, in particular people of color. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I know we've gone a little bit long on this part of the panel discussion, but I think it's important for the panel members themselves and for all the audience to understand what a difficult struggle this is, how long it's been going on, and what a toll it's taking on the people who are fighting it. And that should lead to an understanding of how important it is that something like the Voting Rights Act be passed so that we will have that tool to ease the way into fairness in voting. With that, let's go for a few minutes to the audience and take some questions. And I'm looking here. Don't see any numbers yet. I will make one other comment then while we're waiting. Getting this group of people.
Can I interject?
Yes, absolutely.
So people wanting to ask questions, please hover the mouse at the top. You will see on the right side a hand button. Just click it and you will appear on the screen. Thank you.
Yes, if you just move your cursor to the right part of the screen, you'll see a red hand emblem. And if you click on that, you're going to appear on my screen, and there's going to be a number there, and I see an SM with a number 1. So I don't see a picture there, but I'm going to call on SM. What would you like to ask or comment, please?
Yes, hello, this is Shalene Modi with Hometown Action in Alabama. One question I have is, what opportunities are there to provide a kind of know your voting rights and opportunities, maybe a little bit of a rebranding for the millennials, as Bernard has mentioned, kind of like what opportunity is there to provide kind of a campaign of know your voting rights and opportunities movement to to better inform people. I think of kind of presenting in a format of like some of our subscription services, with taking away some beloved features, things like that. So anyway, yeah, I'm wondering about some activity towards that, towards providing better education.
I can jump in on that. I'm getting an echo. Okay, it's gone. Okay. Well, anyway, what we had a couple years ago, we brought, I think, about 35 Gen Zers together and millennials. And we spent 3 days in Montgomery educating them about the voting process and, kind of, what to expect. And the intent was to use those individuals to go out and educate others that, you come, your circle of influence, educate those individuals. And of course, and this happened in October 2018, and we did not get to continue that in 2020. But I think we've got to begin to galvanize and get those millennial voters together to educate them, and then they can go out and educate others. And And I mean, I'm talking about real, down to earth, what's at stake, and what's your obligation. And so that's kind of a simplistic way of saying, one thing that we've done to try and increase the knowledge of our millennials and Gen Zers.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions right now, and we're just about at our 20-minute limit. So I think what we're going to do is go ahead and end this. I want to thank the questions from the audience and the audience for their participation and for watching these fine presentations. I especially want to thank these panel members. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Let me start over again. Democracy cannot survive amidst apathy or ignorance. What are citizen organizations doing to identify, register, and motivate people to vote? How can we help? Please welcome the president of the League of Women Voters of Tennessee Valley in Alabama, Kathleen Leonard.
I had to unmute. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Since we're doing this virtual and we're on a computer, I'm going to take the opportunity to show you what the League of Women Voters is and what we have been doing to identify, registering, and motivating people to vote. So I'm going to just, first off, I'm going to share a video with you guys that shows you who the League is. So
we are the League of Women Voters of Tennessee Valley, a 100% volunteer, nonpartisan organization committed to making democracy work in Alabama. We work to empower all Alabama voters, not just women. To do that, we promote voter education, voter rights restoration, and voter registration, going to high schools, colleges, and universities, churches, career centers, libraries. Really, find us anywhere in North Alabama. We work to bring candidates and government officials in front of the people to answer questions and be held accountable. We advocate for laws that ensure that voting is free and fair for all Alabamians. We remember that the right to vote in America was hard-won, and we bring that passion into the 21st century into our commitment to Alabama's voters. We are the League of Women Voters of Tennessee Valley, making democracy work. Follow us on the web or on social media at LWVTNV.
So I want to emphasize a couple of things that that we do. We go to high schools, we do voter drives, we do voter rights restoration, and a lot of this is face-to-face grassroots types of activities that when the pandemic happened, we had to do a pivot, and so we had to go into the virtual world. And as I was preparing for this discussion and presentation, I was thinking, okay, how do I tell you guys about what successes that we had doing this? And I was looking around our resources, our web page and our YouTube page, and I realized that I could just show you on our YouTube page practically everything that we did. So I'm going to show you our YouTube page. And so if you take a look at what I've got up here, as COVID kicked up, we knew we still needed to get people registered to vote, and we needed to do it safely. And so the first thought that came to mind is we wanted to do things in a drive-up kind of configuration, so they'd be safely in their cars and we'd be behind our masks, and we'd have a safe way of getting people registered. And so we started doing that, and we recognized that absentee ballots were going to be very important, and so we started working on absentee ballots. And we'll come on down here, and people really needed to know how the absentee ballot process worked. So you couldn't get up close to somebody with a form and show them how it worked. So we started putting videos out. So we have a whole series of voter services videos that we did. And we realized that we had to get to people with things that were interesting to them. And so you're going to see that we did music videos. So we partnered with Jordan Moore, Chill City, Microwave Dave, Victoria Jones, and we did a series of video concerts, both live and recorded, where we were getting out the message about voting. And then we did a series of videos that were aimed at getting information out about voter registration and how you register to vote, what it's like to participate in the elections, encouraging people to vote. And you have to get the video into the hands of people, and you've got to get them watching. So this video here on Election Day, we promoted that through Facebook advertising. And for those of you that aren't using Facebook advertising, we had some pretty good success with that. We got 1,500 organic engagements with that video, but when we put some money on it, we actually upped that to like 9,500 on top of our 1,500 organic. So we've learned to start using our social media better in order to find and identify those people that need to get information about voting. And that's been very successful, not only in these information videos as far as how to register, what to do with COVID, but also in reaching people that need their voter rights restored, because we have a capability with other partners to advertise on social media where we reach out to people who need their voter rights restored. And people who need their voter rights restored, they don't usually come out and admit to you when you're at a festival, hey, I've got a criminal record and I need my voter rights restored. So by asking them on social media, here's a phone number you could call to get someone to help you, that's much more effective than just going out and canvassing. So we're learning new ways of doing things. We also are starting to be at the right place to get the right people that we need. So, you know, obviously high school voter drives are pretty obvious about ways to get to high school students, but being at places to get to people who need their voter rights restored is important too. And as far as motivation, we want things to be engaging to our youth. We want to be enthusiastic. We need to get people to understand how important local elections are. And so we're looking at ways to get the youth engaged and understand and interested in both local elections and get them to understand that what they do matters. And we also need to get them over the fear of voting, understand what voting is like. So we've worked with the probate judge to actually bring the voting machines into the schools so that they can vote on real ballots. So they get a ballot and they can go and so we've had a lot of success with these sorts of things, and we're not the only ones doing this, and others can duplicate this in their communities, and we're here to help and work with folks to do this. So thank you for having me here to talk to you about how we might identify, register, and motivate people to vote.
Hanu, can you hear us? We can't hear you. Hmm. Maybe we should go to Austin straight away. Austin, can you unmute and get going?
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm a junior from Madison, Alabama. A little bit about the role of youth in protecting voting in Alabama and the United States as a whole. Before I begin, I'll tell you all a little bit about me. So I currently work on behalf of two organizations, the first being the Youth Activist Coalition, an organization founded by three organizers, Tyler Johnson, Bailey Shade, and I, and we met at the ACLU National Advocacy Institute. We learned skills about advocating for causes such as reform, LGBTQ+ rights, as well as the influence that systemic racism has on our society. Additionally, I'm a founder of an organization called the Teen View, a writing platform that allows students in the state of Alabama to voice their opinion about political, cultural, and social issues that they want to spread light on. With skills that I have learned about youth participation and involvement, I've had the opportunity to work on behalf of local campaigns for both political candidates and to rally for the right. Previously, I director for the organization Students Against Voter Suppression, which had members from states such as California, Texas, Alabama, Pennsylvania, and many more, and we work to spread awareness about voter suppression and how it counteracts democratic practices and undermines the right of the citizenry. While in this organization, I worked with other young activists to spread awareness on many laws and citizens across the country, such as the institution of harsh voter ID, gerrymandering of congressional districts, partisanship in election boards, closing polling stations, many of which occurred after the landmark case Shelby County v. Holder. Working on these issues, I found out so much more about the history, the dark history, and legacy of voter suppression and intimidation in the United States, going all the way back centuries with black codes, literacy tests, poll taxes, and much more that were put into place in order to abridge participate in elections. As the next generation, it is our duty to ensure that every eligible voter has the opportunity to cast a ballot for the candidate that they choose. When it comes to advocating for the rights of voters and ensuring that that right is not violated by hyper-partisan politicians, it is imperative for us as young people to educate ourselves on the issues occurring all around us. In states all here in the southern United States, where governments have long endorsed the right to vote, out and advocate against all attempts to circumvent our abilities to participate in local, state, and federal election cycles, the rights that we have as American citizens. In the state of Alabama, throughout our history, the government in Alabama has not taken the political rights of people of color with the value as they have our counterparts. As young people who will be voting in the next few years, we demand that local politicians and policymakers implement reform, not contract the right to vote based on misinformation and deliberate lying. In our state, we have a state government to vote seriously in recent years and has imposed harsh voter ID requirements, unnecessarily purged voters from the rolls, shut down polling places, among a number of actions taken to prevent eligible voters who are minorities from casting a ballot. In Alabama, over 100 do not have access to a photo ID, which has prevented many from being able to cast a ballot, affect Black voters and other minority voters. A large part of this is deliberate efforts by states over the past few years not to register voters, with thousands of eligible voters not being registered just due to the fact that they're not cognizant that they can vote. As young people who are interested in fighting for a number of causes that will affect the future of our generation, we must not only advocate for the right to vote, but people all over the country about how to exercise their right. Will be adversely affected by issues such as climate to reproductive justice, increase political polarization, and the best way that we can do to prevent these issues from solidifying is to exercise our right to vote right now. I can't vote. Some people out there who are watching may not be able to vote, but there's still a number of steps that I'll go through that can be taken to participate in our election systems and fight for the fundamental. First, we must educate ourselves on the issues that are, whether that be environmental protection, protecting the right to justice, income inequality, and much more. The issues that matter most to us and research a potential solution, we can choose the candidates that will help us achieve those goals in the proper manner. Even if we cannot vote as young people, we can participate in protest movements that advocate for our right to vote. We can show up to city council meetings and voice our opinions on measures that we believe will impact our community. We can organize a community discussion panel, an event. There are a number of actions that show our elected leaders that we want to be heard to us. Second, we need to get our friends involved. When organizing, it is impactful when there are more people taking part, and this is a good reason to get your close friends involved. Try to educate and collaboratively learn the attacks that are being taken place on our right to vote, and we can form more full reactions to those to make sure that those do not. In addition to voting rights, collective organizing is beneficial in all types of protest movements, protecting the rights of undocumented immigrants to racial equity. Third, we need to make our voice heard. Whether this is writing an LTE, which stands for letter to the editor, submitting a column to your local officials, leading a protest, speaking at a community town hall or board meeting, or even just emailing your local institution, all can be beneficial in making sure that your voice is heard. While at students participated in many emails to support of S1 or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Even though my representative is Mo Brooks, he's not very likely to listen to official to let those representatives know that they have constituents who care about these issues and that will hold them accountable at the ballot box if they do not listen to our opinions as well as our facts behind the issue. This applies senators, mayors, governors, council members. As long as you have contact with them regarding the issue, they will eventually have to listen. Fourth, you need to educate those around you. This step applies to both parents and children who are interested in activism and in order to form an atmosphere where more people are cognizant of the attacks that we have seen on our voting rights throughout our history and even today, we must spread information to those around us to ensure that they're aware of these issues. Recently, when I served as a page for the Georgia Democratic Party, the biggest people was that people just didn't work. We must educate about how to use absentee ballots, how to vote early, the process of know what ballot carrying is, and a number of other steps that we can use to increase the voter turnout in our elections and mitigate the impacts of these measures that they're seeking to limit right to vote. Fifth, we need to intersect voting rights with other issues. When we're trying to spread awareness on the importance of protecting voting rights, we must intersect this with a number of issues such as ourselves these questions. Will we vote for to get which politicians will allow regulations to be announced power and flexibility of the fossil fuel industry? Which politicians will implement reforms such as banning no-knock warrants, creating police misconduct databases, and reappropriating excess funds to police? Which politicians will push for the United States to stop refugees and stand up for the rights of